I spend a lot of time in reflection. It's a driving force of my work as an activist and solidifies my love affair with being a writer. To be able to hold someone's thoughts in your hands and connect with a moment in time is something that I do not take lightly. I see written work, art, and music of the past as roadmaps and directions to liberation. From a very young age, I wanted to make a difference. My dream to become president was actually squandered by an ill-informed elementary school teacher that told me it wasn't possible because I wasn't born in the United States. And I do often think about how many of us had had our dreams taken away because of someone else's ignorance, especially in a time before the internet existed. To reference the great philosopher Auntie Badu, I'm an analog human in a digital world. I spend most of my time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as I work towards solutions for today and the future. If the civil rights movement, Stonewall, and the Black liberation movement laid the groundwork, growing up in the 80s and 90s solidified my desire to create change. While many kids my age were watching MTV, I was learning about Mamiya and the Move 9 and watching my birth country unify with protest in the fall of the Berlin Wall, and witnessing Nelson Mandela with a fist raised in the air walking out of prison, and again as he was being sworn as South Africa's first freely elected president. I have seen the power that comes when people stand up and fight for what is just, and felt the swell of pride that comes with evoking change. I have also seen the danger that comes with settling into the status quo and assuming that one moment is enough. It's the pendulum swing of justice into backlash. It's what Dr. King wrote about in Where Do We Go From Here? It's 54% in 2016 and 74 million in 2020. It's Amanda Gorman speaking life into a nation on the steps of this Capitol building and then being questioned if she belongs in the steps of her own home. It's statements for Black Lives in June to executive director job postings seeking to maintain core white audiences in February. It is the one thing that I think about most. How do we move so quickly from protesting and speaking truth to power to swallowing truth and silently going back to that dangerous realm of status quo? Now, speaking truth to power is a phrase you'll hear a lot, especially from my mouth because I am a self-proclaimed superfan of Bayard Rustin. In 1955, he was a contributing author to a publication distributed by American Friends Service Committee as a resource guide to alternatives to violence. It is essentially the playbook of the nonviolent movement of the civil rights era and the peaceful protest of today. Now, I'm actually reluctant to use the term peaceful or nonviolent because at its core, the protests were meant to show the world the inhumanity of itself by silently taking the abuse of others, setting that precedent that not fighting back and silently enduring is how you really create change. Peaceful, in this context, refers to how one interacts with abusers. The only difference between what happened in Birmingham in '63 and Ferguson in 2014 and Minneapolis in 2020, what turns a peaceful protest into a supposed riot, is in fact the actions of those protesting. It's not what's being done to the protesters, because that's always been the same. Somehow violence isn't violence when it comes from the state or systems. It's just how things are done. Really showing how dangerous that status quo is. The reason why I'm a self-proclaimed superfan is because Bayard Rustin was the man that taught Dr. King the concept of nonviolent protest and was the main organizer for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He literally and figuratively created the platform that brought acclaim to Dr. King and the civil rights movement as a whole. Yet most people don't know about him because he was an out gay Black man, and that fact alone ostracized him as a human and allowed others to take credit for his work. He chose to take a back seat and work behind the scene because he didn't want to harm the movement or tarnish Dr. King's name. Right? Like, as he was coining the term speaking truth to power, he was being asked to be silent about his own truth. Yes, he was publicly out, but he wasn't embraced publicly as a whole person just for his work, and only if he didn't center himself. And rarely do we talk about the harm that actually comes from forcing someone to be silent about their suffering. It's a lesson I learned at the age of 6 from the body of an abuser that in one breath told me this is what mommies and daddies do, and the next that if I spoke of what was happening, it would bring harm to the people I cared most about. My silence would become my protection. Silence became the mask that would help me get through the abuse of others, eventually my rape, and even helps me keep my composure in moments of being disrespected on my job. It's a mask that is embedded into not just my psyche, but the vast majority of us within this society. So many people within my bloodline have had to silently endure the darkness of others. Being told is the price you pay for existing, and being tasked with surviving more than anyone should have to. My great-grandfather on my maternal side lost his life for assisting Jewish families. My ancestors on my paternal side were forced into unpaid labor because of their pigmentation. It's the oldest story that's ever been told. Existing outside the rules of the status quo comes with punishment. And it's a dangerous system based on archaic beliefs. Genitalia determines your pay rate and whom you should be partnered with. Skin tone determines your access to resources. Religious beliefs dictate laws that they're supposed to be separate from, right? And the list goes on and on and on. Just be quiet, accept what you've been given, and no one will get hurt. But someone always gets hurt, and it's rarely the ones that cause the harm or the ones that set the rules, the actual abusers themselves. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I'm a writer. Composition notebooks have been a place of refuge for me, especially as I was silently dealing with what life was throwing at me. Not only as a survivor of childhood trauma, but also learning to navigate as a biracial child of an immigrant in the Midwest. My notebooks weren't just a space to speak freely, but was a space where no one could actually talk back. It became my salvation. It was only one of the only places that I allowed myself to be fully honest. Like many other spoken word artists would tell you, there comes a time when words on paper just aren't enough, and I had to speak them to release them. My beloved Bayard also once said, when an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. And performing and curating my own open mic became that space that I could actualize that notion. The spaces I curated intentionally centered those cast into the margins to be able to show up as their true selves and be seen and heard. Embracing dignity not through protest, but through art. It is my poetry that actually opened the door to my activism. In my adult life, I first became activated during the age of RFRA and the push to legalize gay marriage. RFRA was a bill that would legalize discrimination against people for religious beliefs, targeting non-hetero folks and the right to folks with uteruses to not be able to control their bodies. And I took a stand as an ally for gay rights, never admitting that deep down I was actually fighting for myself. Through it all, I had swallowed the truth of not being heterosexual. I made the conscious decision to hide that part of myself to supposedly protect my children. I knew how difficult it was to grow up as multiracial in the Midwest. I was experiencing the hardship of explaining to people that I wasn't the nanny of my own fair-skinned children. And I chose to hide that part of myself to try to kind of fit into that dangerous box of status quo just a little bit more. I fought for people to have what I dreamed of secretly, except for in my notebooks and subtle comments to strangers along the way. And I had no idea how much my life would parallel my hero. Now, I did finally make the decision to come out, and I stood proud in carrying on Bayard's legacy, even working for America Friends Service Committee up until the Indianapolis office was cut from programming. Now, things started really taking a turn for me towards the end of 2017. I was coming to terms with my relationship to alcohol. I was dealing with my home being broken into while I was in it and receiving no help from the very police that I was actively protesting against. The IRS wiped out my bank account and led to an eviction and my family facing homelessness. And I silently swallowed these truths about myself as I stood speaking at rallies with thousands in attendance, asking them to take a stand for immigration rights and Black lives and rectifying our relationship with Indigenous groups here and in Palestine. I put the movement's needs before my own for the greater good. I chose to be silent about my own struggles, to speak about the silence and the struggles of others. This all came to a head in 2018 when I was asked by the youth to speak at the March for Our Lives rally. I knew that moment would change my life. There is no greater honor than to be asked by youth to speak about issues concerning them. Being acknowledged by the youth as a truth speaker was, and still to this day, one of my greatest honors. Because I truly believe that when the youth speak, you listen, and when they ask you, you show up. What I didn't know was that 6 seconds of that speech would be turned into white supremacist propaganda, and I would become clickbait on YouTube. The video itself received over 1,000 comments and became a horrific reminder of what people say behind closed doors. And every facet of my life was used to attack me. Now, this was all happening at the same time that I was being targeted due to my work for Palestinian liberation, as well as for my writings, speaking directly about the harm caused by white women centering themselves in the social justice movement and in nonprofits. I was beginning to have to coordinate security details for my speaking engagements, and having police mysteriously park in front of the home I was able to stay at due to a dear friend's kindness. My livelihood and my life was under attack, and there was nowhere that I felt safe anymore. I actively worked to keep my private life, especially my home life, separate from my work. But that video was the moment when it all came crashing down. The video and the backlash that came from being outspoken was the tree falling, and it stopped me in my path. It forced me to reflect on my role in the movement and really to think about what I was willing to live with as an occupational hazard to speaking out about the dangers of the status quo. In one moment, I was able to witness that pendulum swing of justice to backlash. People often talk about the burnout that comes from this work while somehow ignoring how many lives have been lost because of it. Dr. King is used as a model of protesting, negating the violence that actually killed him. Bayard Rustin is left out of the conversation because of who he loved, negating that he wasn't loved as a whole human. And just like imagine how far we would have been if during the civil rights era, Bayard was centered in the movement as a leader he deserved to be. And I really want us to think about how ingrained it is in us, this notion that we must silently endure the abuse of others or accept that abuse exists simply because it is the way it is. This notion that if we remain silent and accept the lie and abuse to maintain the status quo is by far the most detrimental thing we can do as a society. A status quo that gets its strength from accepting violence from abusers and silence from those that are being harmed the most. And each of us is enduring harm, whether it is internalized in an effort to fit into that dangerous status quo or externalized by a world that refuses to see you, or being silent about the microaggressions you face every day, or allowing others to be harmed for our comfort. It can be for the greater good of the movement or conditional love within your own family. And there comes a time when we all must be tasked with a self-reflection in terms of what we're willing to keep silent about and what we're willing to speak up for. And it doesn't need to be when you feel like your life is in danger, and it shouldn't be attached to the loss of another Black life. Progress won't happen until we free ourselves from the ties of that dangerous realm of status quo and acknowledge our role in someone else's oppression, or even our own. Speaking truth to power isn't just about the injustices at the hands of oppressors. It's about being honest with ourselves, and that is where the real power in our liberation is.